Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I believe we are recording. Welcome to the off-campus leasing and renting workshop. I am Stacy Williams. I'm the Director of Student Legal Services, and we are presenting this workshop on off-campus leasing and renting. This evening, the workshop is actually hosted by the Division of Student Affairs. So welcome. In tonight's program, we have a few goals that we're going to focus on. The first is to help you to understand rights and responsibilities as a tenant. The second is to explain your landlord's responsibilities under the law. We're going to go through some common lease terms and explain what they mean. And then we're going to give you some resources you need to have a successful off-campus living experience. Before we get started with some of the other substance of our program, I just want to say a few words about Student Legal Services. We are an on-campus law office for IU Bloomington students. SLS is funded by the mandatory student fees that most students pay, and all students who pay those fees are eligible for our service. And the fee per student per semester is just about $9.25. For students who pay that fee, there's no additional charge for our service. Although when cases go to court, we do have to pay filing fees. And so sometimes there will be out-of-pocket costs in those cases. Advice and representation in most civil law matters is provided. We do provide advice in criminal matters as well, but we don't represent students in those cases. We're not allowed to represent students versus students because the students who pay the fee are all considered our clients, and that's considered a conflict of interest for us as attorneys. We're also not allowed to represent students against the university, so those are just a couple of restrictions in our service. SLS is a department within the Division of Student Affairs, and we're going to hear more about that in just a couple of minutes. It's important to know about the Division of Student Affairs generally as a student here at IU Bloomington. To schedule an appointment at Student Legal Services, you can just go to our website at getlegal.indiana.edu and click the schedule an appointment button. So it's a very easy process to get set up for our service, and it only costs you a little bit of time. This is a picture of the Student Legal Services full-time staff. This was during the days when everyone was masking, so it's a little bit outdated, but this is our current staff of 4 attorneys and 3 support staff. We also have a group of law students who work in our office, who are 2nd and 3rd year law students and are getting experience working with student clients under the supervision of the attorneys we have on staff. So that's Student Legal Services. And this is inside our current office on campus on North Park Avenue. So here tonight to talk about the Division of Student Affairs is Andy Kalis. Andy is one of the assistant deans within the division, and I will let Andy take it from here.
Thanks, Stacy. So the Division of Student Affairs really is a comprehensive group of 22 different departments on campus that all are here to support all students, undergraduate students and graduate students, mostly in their experience as students in outside the classroom. Not that we don't coordinate with faculty and different academic units, but we just wanted to highlight for students when they think of moving off campus. Sometimes you think there's a misconception that students are not eligible to still utilize the services that are on campus. And that's not the case. So you can see, I won't go over this whole list with you, but everything from our care team and Center for Veteran and Military Students to Disability Student Services, the Indiana Memorial Union, Campus Rec actually has been added to the division this summer, the Student Health Center, all of those services that you use and really don't even probably think about them as part of a division is part of the division. And so the ones today, Stacy is talking about Student Legal Services, and we'll go into more detail about how they work to support off-campus living. And then I am situated in the Dean of Students office as one of the assistant deans, and while we don't have an office dedicated to off-campus living programming, we do have the intention to support your off-campus living experience. And so as you learn more about student legal services today, as you learn more about what the city of Bloomington has to offer as in support of your off-campus living experience, I'd like to simply plant the seed that our office, and specifically me and our office, is also here to support that experience. So good or bad questions that develop, my job really is centered around helping students navigate the various support services that are available to them. And certainly if you're having an experience that you're not sure where to go or how to access different support resources, we're a great place to start. And working with me, I can help you with that. We have a section on our website called Communities. And in that drop-down menu on the Division of Student Affairs, we've curated some resources that hopefully, if you ever need to look either at the City of Bloomington resources, we've kind of curated some quick links to access the various things that could be helpful for you as a student living off campus to know about or easily access from the Division of Student Affairs website. Our colleague Angela with the City of Bloomington will go over the Housing and Neighborhood Development Program and how they can help students, but we're always looking to enhance that section of our website to further give you quicker access to things that are relevant to your off-campus living experience. Another significant part of living off campus is navigating how to get around. And so learning whether it's the campus bus, the City of Bloomington bus, there are safety escorts, maps of Bloomington, how to access the airport shuttle that goes to Indy, parking operations. Again, we've tried to curate some helpful quick links on our website, again, under the Communities tab for off-campus living. And then a lot of students will use one.IU's classifieds or word of mouth, maybe the IDS, to look for off-campus rentals. And again, we've got another section of our website dedicated to some of the portals that take you into resources for off-campus living. Maybe you found a great apartment or house rental with friends, and maybe you're going to be there for all the years that you're going to live off campus and be here at IU, but maybe you need to look for something new. And so we have curated off-campus living, sort of a housing search section that hopefully would give you easier access to find some of those. So IU doesn't endorse any off-campus property, but again, we're trying to curate information for you to further evaluate and look into for yourself. And certainly, sometimes students that choose to live off campus might not think about the apartment style housing through residential programs and services. And while you are required as an IU student to live on campus for your first year, after that, there are non-dorm options. So you can move into an apartment style housing with residential programs and services. So it's a housing option that is IU based. But you might not think of them when you're thinking of moving off campus, but they have several apartment complexes situated around campus on the peripheries of campus. So you kind of get an off-campus experience, apartment living, and yet still have quicker access to campus.
All right, thank you, Andy.
Thanks.
And
so I'll be here still for questions in the chat and afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy, for that information about the division. It's a very important part of the university. Can be very useful for students in all kinds of areas. So next we're going to talk about leasing in Bloomington. And this is Angela Van Roy here with us this evening from Housing and Neighborhood Development with the City of Bloomington.
Thank you, Stacy. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad that you're here. I've got information to share with you that is important for anyone living in Bloomington and renting in Bloomington. Our office is, first of all, the website you see there, the welcome website, has a lot of information for just about anything that you need to know when you first move in. So I suggest that you visit that particular website and check out the links on there. Information about all of the various city services, not just my department, but also parking and sanitation and utilities and all the things that you need to know. So you can go on to the next slide. Thanks. So primarily what the hand department does that will be of relevance to you is the rental inspection program. Now we inspect every single rental unit, whether it's a house or an apartment, every single rental unit within the city of Bloomington limits. And our task is to make sure that housing is safe and livable for the people that live there. We do not have any involvement in legal issues. So Stacy in her office would be the people to talk to if you had leasing problems or issues with any kind of contractual agreement you have with your landlord. But if the physical structure itself is problematic, that's where we come in. So every 3 to 5 years, we will inspect each rental unit. Upon completion of that inspection to make sure that everything is as it should be and up to the standards of our code as written in the Bloomington Municipal Code, that landlord will be issued a residential rental occupancy permit. And the picture here, it's maybe too small for you to see the details, but that's what your permit looks like. It is required by law that the permit should be somewhere within the unit where you can see it. So it should be posted somewhere, maybe inside a closet door, but it should be available for tenants to be able to view that. And there are some important items on there that you might want to check to be sure that it is up to date. Look at the expiration date, especially to make sure that you actually are living in a legally rentable unit. Next slide, thanks. So if you have a problem with your rental unit, what do? Well, the first thing you want to do is get in touch with your landlord. You can make a phone call if that's easier, or you can send an email. But if you do make a phone call, discuss what the problems are, come up with a time frame for when those repairs should be made. And then if your first initial contact was a phone call, immediately follow that up in writing. So whether that's a text message or an email, restate what it is you agreed to. If that problem is not solved within the time frame that you have agreed upon, call our office, and our number is right there. You can file a complaint inspection, and you can find a form for a complaint form on our website. You can fill that out. Once you submit that to our office, someone within our office will call you to set up an inspection to come. If I have one of our inspectors will come out to see if the complaint is valid. They will have they can only look at the specific things that are written in the complaint. So you have to be very specific. And if they deem that it is a valid complaint, we will then require that the landlord make those repairs. So you never feel like you are on your own. We have this rental inspection program in the city of Bloomington. We're one of only 3 or 4 within the entire state municipalities that have this kind of program. And we're here to make sure that housing is decent. So, make sure you call us if you need to. Other things that you can do when you move off campus and into a rental unit for perhaps the first time is to educate yourself about the local rules. Now, you may not have had to do these things when you lived at home with your parents. You may not have been aware of what the rules were in the place where you came from, but you need to know what they are now because you are going to need to abide by those. So there are specific rules for how to dispose of your trash and recycling, where your carts should be stored. Fun fact, they should not be stored at the curb. They should be up near your house on any day except for trash day. If there's noise, if you're creating noise, whether it's music or a loud gathering or something, if that noise can be heard from the inside of your house, out on the street, or inside your neighbor's home, then it's too loud. And Bloomington does have a noise ordinance that is enforced 24 hours a day. There are some stiff fines for that if you repeatedly break those rules. So make sure you educate yourself about that. Also, cars and parking. if you live in a residential neighborhood, there's a good chance you will need a residential parking permit. So make sure you find out if you need that. You can, again, go to the city website. There are maps there that will tell you exactly where you live. You put your address in, it'll tell you if you need a permit. You can, if you live in a house with lots of roommates, you may have a lot of cars. If everyone's got their own car, that can sometimes be a problem, particularly in some of our older neighborhoods downtown where the streets are narrow and there's just not a lot of space to park. So you need to know what the rules are. One thing you cannot do is park on the front lawn. You have to be parked on what's called an improved surface. So all these things is lots of information you need to educate yourself. The website that I had on the first slide, which is bloomington.in.gov/welcome. That place is where you can go to find out all of these details. So there are links on there for all of this information and much, much more. And then finally, you want to introduce yourself to your neighbors, be a good neighbor. That's a huge part of doing well when you move off campus, not just following all the rules, although that's fantastic. It's also nice to know who you live next door to. If you're going to have a party, letting your neighbors know can go a long way in them not calling the police because it's too noisy. So I encourage you to introduce yourself, exchange phone numbers. And the other thing, if you need help, if your neighbors know you, they'll be happy to help. You need a hammer, or you need a ladder, or you need something, that you probably didn't bring with you. I'm sure you'd find a nice, friendly neighbor who would be happy to help you out with those sorts of things. So make yourself known in the neighborhood in a good way by introducing yourself. And it'll be nice for you as well. It'd be much nicer to have people nearby. Okay, so one other thing I want to tell you about is a project that I've been working on along with Stacy and Andy for the last year and a half or so. It's called the B-Town Neighboring Project. We've gone through a number of different steps with this project, and where we are right now is I have a group of 5 IU students with whom I work, and they are in the process of creating a student organization on campus. So the whole project is about educating off-campus students and fostering relationships to be good neighbors, just like we were talking about. And this student organization is getting themselves up and running so that students will have a role to play in that, in the education of their peers. So not only will information come from the city about rules and regulations, information will come from IU about things you need to know. But also we want students to be peers to help educate and support one another once you move off campus. So if you are interested in being involved in this type of an organization, it is an official IU student org. It's just in the baby step stages right now, getting up and running. Please email me. My email is there on the screen, and I would be happy to give you some more information and get you in contact with the students that are working on that project. Okay, and this is my last slide. So that is our contact information. Again, my department is Housing and Neighborhood Development. We are known as HAND. We are in City Hall, which is on North Morton Street. That's our general email. You can email me personally as well. I'm happy to take any questions and get you, point you in the right direction if I don't have information that you need. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Angela. And before we get into talking about leases, I just wanted to emphasize the importance of anybody living off campus knowing about HAND and having their information in the event that they run into problems. Student Legal Services refers students to HAND all the time, either to ask for a complaint inspection or to look at a file on a property over there. So I encourage everyone to use this information that Angela has provided, and Student Legal Services actually has a link to the HAND website on our website as well. So multiple ways to get to that important information. So we're going to talk about leasing, and one of the first and most important things to keep in mind is that you're signing a contract. It's called a lease contract in Indiana, and it's good to know what that lease says. A good way to understand the lease that you're signing is to make an appointment with SLS for a free lease analysis. Before you sign this contract, which is a binding contract, we will sit down with you and go over its terms and explain to you what you're getting into and talk to you about even potential areas of compromise with the landlord and how to handle those situations. So it's really an educational session. A lot of what we are covering in this workshop, we will go over with the individual student at a lease analysis session. It's a good idea to read the lease before you sign it. I know some of them are really lengthy, but you should still make an effort to read it and make note of any questions you have. And then you'll be ready with those questions when you come in and talk to somebody at Student Legal Services, or if you sit down with private counsel, just to make sure you understand the contract you're signing. And again, in Indiana, leases are binding contracts. And as soon as you sign, you're bound by its terms. So it's a good idea to have an attorney look that over. And if you come to SLS to do that, it only costs you time. The next thing we're going to talk about are a couple of different kinds of lease contracts that we see in Bloomington. The first, joint and several liability contract, is the most common type of lease that we see. These are the contracts where all tenants sign the same agreement. And by signing the same lease contract with your roommates, meaning you all sign the same document as tenants under that lease, you're agreeing to be held liable for your roommate's actions or non-payment under that lease. Essentially, this means that by signing it, you're agreeing to be responsible for everything due and owing under that lease, but you're sharing that responsibility with the other tenants who signed that contract. And so our tip for joint and several liability leases, we're going to have these SMART tips throughout this discussion, is to choose your roommates carefully. If you're agreeing to be individually liable for all of the rent due under a lease, and you're also agreeing to share that responsibility with other tenants, it's a really good idea to be careful about who you're signing that contract with, because you want to make sure that those other tenants are going to be responsible like you are. Another thing to keep in mind is to not sign the lease until all the roommates have signed, or if you're all signing together, because landlords will hold you to the lease contract, even if you're the only one of your roommates to sign. So if you go sign a contract and then your roommates who are planning to sign back out, you could still be held liable under that agreement you signed, even if your roommates didn't sign it. So just think about that timing when all of the tenants are required to sign the same agreement. It's a good idea to do that all at the same time. The next kind of agreement that we see in Bloomington are by the room leases. These are the individual lease contracts where each tenant signs a separate lease. There may be 4 bedrooms in a rental unit and 4 tenants living there in this type of situation. But if it's a by the room lease, each tenant has signed their own individual lease contract. In these agreements, the rental space is typically defined as something like a personal bedroom and maybe a bathroom with shared use of common areas like living rooms and kitchens. These leases often do include some joint and several liability. Generally, those are for those types of common areas that all of the tenants are using. A landlord might be able to pick roommates or require tenants to move to another unit during the lease term with little notice under by the room leases. Meaning that by signing this agreement, you're agreeing that if one of the roommates who's going to be living in the unit with you moves out, you're agreeing that the landlord can pick someone to take their place. And so you should consider whether you're willing to live with a stranger in the same apartment that you didn't choose to live with. It's a consideration on these by the room leases. That may or may not happen, but it is what you're agreeing to typically. So you want to do your research. If you find one of these places you want to rent and you like the idea of a by the room lease, you can talk to the landlord about their policies on roommate replacement and hopefully work that out. The good thing about by the room leases is that it's not complete joint and several liability, but there are downsides as well. Lease terms, and what we're talking about is how long the lease lasts. How long are you under contract in these leases? Most lease terms in Bloomington are for 12 months. They typically run from August to the end of July or August to August. It's really good to keep in mind as students living here in Bloomington that if you graduate, if you move away to maybe study overseas or take an internship, if you find yourself experiencing some financial hardship, maybe you hopefully not going to drop out of school, or if you find yourself in disagreements with roommates, none of those are reasons in Indiana for getting out of your lease. Landlords are not required to release tenants from their lease obligations, even if they can't afford to pay rent or if they're leaving town. Especially landlords in Bloomington are well aware of the school calendar, and so they know that a lot of their tenants are looking at leaving town in May. And so what we suggest and our smart tip here is to look at the lease, think about your plans for summer or studying overseas, or look at when you're graduating and think about what the lease says for subletting. If you're under a lease contract past the date when you're going to be leaving Bloomington, either you're going to stay legal under that contract, you're going to need to pay that rent ahead of time, or look at finding someone to take your place on the lease to pay rent and utilities, and that would be a subletter. So speaking of utilities, if the lease doesn't say who pays for a utility, the tenant's probably going to be the one to have to pay it as the occupant of the rental unit and the person using those utilities. Generally, tenants are responsible for paying some or all of the utilities, and that's typically going to include electric, water, maybe gas service, and internet during the lease term. And it's good to keep in mind that you may actually be required to put the utilities in your name. That is often the case. So the owner or the manager of the rental property will have the utility in their name until you move in, and then they will tell you who you need to contact, which company, to set up the service under your name as the tenant. If it's not clear in the lease who is responsible for what, you need to talk to your landlord and get that clarified and written into the lease before you sign, because this is a fundamental responsibility of the tenants to keep the utilities on typically and running. And so you want to make sure that you're clear on what your responsibilities are in this area. I've put up several slides in this workshop. I'm not going to click on the link and take us out of the presentation because I think it will hold up our flow here, but I am including these slides with the SLS website link, in part because I want everyone to be reminded, and I want to be reminded to tell everyone that SLS has a lot of this information on our website. And I'll keep reminding you of that throughout. So we have information about the different types of leases and what to do throughout your tenancy in certain situations. And I'm going to be coming back to this type of slide as I move forward. So that's just a warning, and to let you know there's a reason I'm not clicking on this link. It's just a reminder to check out our website for more information, which, as an easier way to find, you can look for getlegal.indiana.edu. So we're going to talk about communication. Communication is key in so many areas of life, just about all of them. And it's particularly important as tenants are out living in the community and dealing with landlords and potential complications in their rental units. So communication with your landlord starts before you even sign a lease and move in. You're going to be talking to the landlord about the property, talking to them about the rent and what the other obligations are under the lease. You may be negotiating some terms, maybe especially after you come to SLS for a lease analysis and get an idea of and get some guidance on how to talk to your landlord about these issues. And then once you've gone through that process of looking at the rental unit, going through the terms, getting your lease analysis, if you are able to negotiate any changes in the lease or add any terms to it, then you want to be sure to put that in writing and have all of the parties sign off on it. So it's very important that you do this and not take the word of leasing agents who may mean well in telling you that you can add these terms, or you don't have to worry about this one term that's clearly in the lease. If you're dealing with leasing agents or landlords who are saying those things to you, be sure to write that into the lease itself and have everybody sign off on it. The concern is that that contract probably contains a provision that says that anything that's not in writing is not going to be enforceable. We're going to go over that term here in just a little bit, but keep it as a general rule. Put everything in writing, including any changes or additions to the lease itself, perhaps most importantly. Next, we're going to talk about some things to keep in mind at move-in, because this is a pretty crucial part of the lease term. Essentially, at move-in, you have a chance as a tenant to create a very good and clear record of the condition of the rental unit at the time you move in. This is a good way to protect yourself from being charged for damages at the end of the lease that you did not create. So the local ordinances that Angela was mentioning earlier contain a requirement that landlords and tenants conduct joint inspections on the rental properties. There is supposed to be a joint move-in inspection at the beginning of the lease, and that is supposed to happen within 10 days of the tenant moving in. And then there's also a joint move-out requirement, a joint move-out inspection. So the way the joint move-in inspection works is you want to schedule that inspection with your landlord as soon as you can. The landlords in Bloomington know about the joint move-in inspection process. The ordinance requires that it be done within 10 days of move-in. We recommend that it be done as soon as possible before the tenant's belongings are moved in and settled throughout the rental unit. This makes it easier before everything is moved in to do a thorough inspection of the actual condition of the structure. And so what we recommend is that you do a thorough move-in, note any defects that you find, be as thorough as you can, and also take pictures of those defects. Even if the landlord, and there are some landlords who don't participate in this inspection, even if they don't, sometimes they will give you an inspection form to go through this process on your own. You should do that, be thorough, again, take pictures. If the landlord doesn't give you any inspection form and doesn't seem to be supportive of the inspection process, you should still do a move-in inspection. Student Legal Services does have some of these forms, so you can come to see us and we can give you a form to fill out. And also, again, pictures are very important. So be thorough, write everything down, and make sure you take pictures of all pre-existing damage and defects before you move all of your stuff in and get settled. You'll want to keep those pictures throughout your tenancy so that at the end of the lease term, again, you'll have as clear a record of the condition of the place when you moved in as possible to keep you from being charged for things you didn't do. Again, we have all this information on our website, getlegal.indiana.edu. So I encourage everyone to check that out as you're considering moving off campus and living off campus. After you move into a rental unit, problems sometimes do come up. We talk to students about complications and miscommunication and problems with their leasing situations pretty much every day. If you do have an issue while you're living in a rental unit, you want to notify the landlord in writing. Don't just call or drop by the office. I love the way Angela from the city described this earlier. You can give the landlord a call to report the problem, maybe especially if it's kind of an emergency situation and you have an emergency line to call for maintenance. But you want to be sure to follow that up with the writing. Some lease contracts actually require the tenants provide the landlord with notice in writing of any issues with the rental property. But in any event, you want to make sure that you commit whatever notice of the problem that you're providing to some kind of writing. It can be an email, which works really well because there's a date stamp and it's clear when that notice was provided and then when it was received by the landlord. Some landlords regularly communicate by text, and that's okay. It's better than nothing. We have a lot of images of scanned text in our files showing those communications. And then some landlords do use this online portal system to submit a problem. And if you do that, be sure to keep a copy of whatever you submit, keep a copy of an email if you sent it. And again, make sure you have screenshots of the text or keep those texts on hand about any of these issues you've had with your rental unit. I hope there's kind of a common theme that's occurring to folks, and that is keep things in writing, create a record. That's really what we're getting at to help you protect yourself and improve communication throughout your tenancy. So I mentioned this earlier, move-out inspections are also required under the local ordinance. These move-out inspections should take place with the landlord after you have cleaned your rental unit and moved out your belongings, or at least most of your belongings. It's a good idea to take photos of the clean and empty unit as well, so you create a record that you did clean it, which is always a good idea at the end of your lease. You want to conduct a thorough move-out inspection with the landlord, or as I described earlier, on your own if the landlord doesn't participate in this inspection process. And then at the end of the lease, when you're moving out, you want to be sure to provide your forwarding address in writing, and be sure to keep a copy of that. An email is a great way to provide your forwarding address, or you can send a certified letter if you want to be old-fashioned and kind of fancy about it, but that's a good way to show that the landlord received your forwarding address. The landlord will use that forwarding address to return your security deposit and explain any deductions that they might have made from the security deposit. We're going to talk a little bit about the law that requires them to do that and why that forwarding address is so important. So our tip here on move out, as I mentioned, if your landlord refuses to do a joint inspection, do your own and take clear photos of everything. And then I would also add, and we're going to have this tip later, be sure to leave your forwarding address or provide that forwarding address in writing when you move out. Again, we have specific tips here on move out, also included on our website at getlegal.indiana.edu. I told you I was going to be repeating myself on that. Okay, so we're going to get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty law that applies. And this is, again, part of what Student Legal Services will go over with you if you bring your lease in to talk to us about it. And we'll explain how the law applies to your lease and your leasing situation. So in Indiana, we have a few different types of law that apply to leasing situations. First of all, contract law applies, and Indiana is a freedom of contract state. And what that essentially means is that parties are free to agree to almost anything. And unless the contract is illegal or there's some real public policy concern in the agreement, most contracts are going to be considered enforceable and valid. Specifically with residential lease situations, it's a very difficult thing to try to get out of a lease. As I mentioned earlier, reasons like graduation, financial difficulties, roommate disagreements are not legal reasons in Indiana for getting out of your lease as a tenant. And it's always good to keep that in mind. We have a lot of students coming to see us every day who want out of their lease contracts. And we talk to them about the reality of the situation and try to help them find ways to achieve what they need to achieve. But just getting out of a lease contract is a very, very difficult thing to do in Indiana. Under state law, there are some requirements of both landlords and tenants, and these are state statutes. Under these laws, landlords are required to provide rental units to tenants in a safe, clean, and habitable condition. And so when you move into your rental unit to be in compliance with state law, it should be safe, clean, and habitable. Landlords are required to maintain appliances, plumbing systems, heating, and air conditioning systems under state law if they were provided at the time the lease was signed. Tenants are required under state law to use utilities and appliances reasonably while they're living in the rental unit. And tenants are required to keep rental properties reasonably clean under state law. So those are some of the statutes that apply to leases in Indiana. We've talked a little bit about our Bloomington Municipal Code. These are the local ordinances that apply to the city of Bloomington. And so for rental properties within the city of Bloomington, we have a section of our code that does certain things. Landlords are required to register their rental properties with the city of Bloomington. This allows for the city to do those regular inspections that Angela was mentioning earlier. The code also limits the number of people who can occupy a rental unit, so that landlords are not allowed to, stuff as many people as they can to collect as much rent as possible in some of our rental properties in Bloomington. So there are occupancy limits included in this code. If your landlord doesn't fix a problem while you're living in a rental unit, you can, as Angela described earlier, file a complaint with HAND. And as I said earlier, Student Legal Services regularly refers students to HAND to file this complaint. You can just go to their website and, as the occupant of the property, fill out a complaint form. That's something that HAND is going to do for a tenant, as long as the tenant has provided that notice to the landlord and given them a chance to fix it. So if you're having a problem as a tenant in an off-campus rental and you've notified the landlord in writing of the issue, let's say it's February and your furnace stops working, and the landlord doesn't fix the problem, then you can report that to Housing and Neighborhood Development, and they will send an inspector out and note any violations that they find of the ordinance and require the landlord to fix the problem. So it's a very important process, a very important service for tenants to know about who are living in Bloomington. And again, joint move-in and move-out inspections are mentioned in the local ordinance and are supposed to be conducted, as I've described in our previous sections. So we've got contract law, some state law, and some local law, all that applies to your leasing situation. We're going to talk a little bit more about state law and specifically how it applies to security deposits. Security deposits are required in a lot of leasing situations in Bloomington, not all of them, but most landlords do collect a security deposit from their tenants. Typically, the security deposit is going to be an additional payment that you make to the landlord. It's usually in the amount of 1 month's rent. So if your rent is $1,500 a month, the landlord will collect a $1,500 security deposit. All of that will be written into your lease agreement, and the landlord holds onto the security deposit as security for your performance under the lease. And so state law has developed over the years to kind of help govern what landlords can do with those security deposits. The standard for using the security deposit to cover damages to a rental property is that they're not supposed to be used for ordinary wear and tear. They're only supposed to be used for actual damage to the rental unit that's been caused by the tenant. This all gets a little gray and confusing. It's a little squishy, this ordinary wear and tear standard, but it is a recognition in the law that anything that we use is going to see some wear and tear, and tenants shouldn't be charged for that as long as it's reasonable or ordinary wear and tear. If you punch a hole in a wall, that's probably damage beyond ordinary wear and tear. But it can get a little bit more subject to interpretation. And so Student Legal Services works through a lot of those issues with students trying to recover some of their security deposit and challenging some of these deductions as either being ordinary wear and tear or maybe pre-existing the tenancy. Again, those inspections are important, particularly the move-in inspection, to create a record of the condition of the rental unit so that your security deposit isn't taken at the end of the lease to pay for damages you didn't even cause. I have proration issues in here. Certain types of damages that landlords or deductions landlords will try to make from security deposits will be to cover things like carpet replacement or painting. These are large dollar items. They will almost always be depreciable, meaning that landlords can deduct for the depreciation of these capital assets throughout the life of those capital assets. So they're getting a tax advantage every year. We argue on behalf of the tenants that our tenant clients shouldn't have to pay for full carpet replacement when that carpet's been around for 4 or 5 years. And maybe it is at the end of their life, but our client didn't do anything to shorten that life. They just occupy the rental unit toward the end of that asset's life. So what we ask judges to do to minimize the deduction and try to minimize the damage to our student clients is to ask landlords to prorate out those replacement costs for things like carpet and sometimes painting charges to reflect the benefit they've gotten over the course of years through their tax depreciation claims, so that our tenants aren't unfairly charged for damages they didn't cause. And so that's the proration issue. And then also repair versus replacement. We argue on behalf of tenants, and the law requires that landlords repair something if it's cheaper than replacing, or vice versa. Landlords should follow the lowest cost rule when it comes to using security deposits and charging tenants for damages to rental properties. So those are just some of the factors that go into how security deposits can be used and how student legal services can help tenants to kind of minimize these deductions, hopefully, and the damages that they're looking at the end of tenancies. Our smart tip here under security deposits is that Indiana has this 45-day rule. And under this law, your landlord has 45 days from the day your lease ends, and they get that forwarding address in writing to send an itemized list of deductions and or the remaining portion of your security deposit. So they have 45 days as your landlord to tell you what they did with the security deposit, but that time is not going to start running until they know where to send this information, and that's where the written forwarding address comes in. And again, we have lots of information about security deposits and the 45-day rule on our website. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about pets and emotional support animals and certified service animals. Emotional support animals and service animals are not considered pets under the law in this context. Landlords are allowed to prohibit tenants from having pets in the rental units. And also, if landlords do allow pets, they can charge pet fees and additional rent. Anybody living off campus or has lived in an off-campus lease where pets are allowed may have seen that there might be additional rent due each month if you have a pet. There's often a pet addendum added on to the original lease contract. Sometimes you pay an additional pet deposit as security to cover potential damage caused by the animals living in the rental unit. Those are pets, and that's how landlords are allowed to deal with them under these lease contracts. Service animals and emotional support animals are covered under a different area of the law. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act, tenants are allowed to have animals for these specific reasons in rental units, and they can't be charged for them. So for service animals, which are certified service animals, and these are very specifically defined as being either dogs or, I always put miniature horses in here as well, though you don't see that as often. But certified service animals tenants cannot be charged if they have a certified service dog, or I guess miniature horse, or if they have a valid emotional support animal. Emotional support animals are defined a little bit differently from certified service animals. And the federal law doesn't define like what the standard is for having an emotional support animal or what tenants need to prove that it's a valid ESA. Indiana law does lay this out pretty specifically for tenants. Under Indiana law, tenants are required to provide documentation to their landlord of their need for an emotional support animal. It typically will be a letter from a healthcare provider who can attest to the fact that this tenant needs this animal to support them and to help them with their condition. Landlords aren't allowed to, delve into the details or make intrusive inquiries here about what the condition is, but the law does make pretty clear that you have to provide a valid letter proving that this isn't a valid emotional support animal in order to benefit from the no fees or other charges under this law. Again, we have more information about this on our website. So I'm going to spend the next several minutes going over a lease contract. This is taken from an actual lease from a local landlord. It's been changed the names have been changed to protect the innocent, I suppose. But basically, we're just going to go through some of these terms that are really pretty important for tenants to know about when you're signing a lease. So as you can see, this is standard landlord, and there's their information up at the top. The first thing you're typically going to see are what we call material terms in a lease contract. These are the subject of the contract itself. And so you can see up at the top here under the landlord information, the unit itself is identified. The lease term, which is August 1, 22 through July 30, 2023. Rent is $15 a month. That rent's going to be paid in 12 installments, with the first one being due August 1st of 2022. And then the security deposit in this lease is $1,500 or 1 month's rent. And that's the deposit the landlord will hold throughout the tenancy to secure the tenant's performance. This is a joint and several liability lease. That's right there under lease agreement in the intro paragraph. Sometimes I should point out the joint and several liability leases will not include the words joint and several liability. But if it's a lease like this, where all of the tenants are signing the same agreement for one piece of property, agreeing to pay one amount of rent, that is by its terms a joint and several liability lease. So if you're looking at your lease and it seems like it's joint and several, but you don't see those words, it's probably still joint and several. Again, you can bring it into Student Legal Services. We'll talk to you about that. Even if you've already signed it, please feel free to bring it in and ask any questions you have. This landlord was pretty good in their lease term. They make the point that there will be a move-out inspection on the final day of the lease, so the tenant knows what to expect there. And then again, the rent paragraph states that the first installment of rent will be due on the 1st of August, and that's to be paid with one check or money order made payable to the landlord. A lot of these rent provisions will include specific payment instructions, and that's a good thing to keep an eye on. So you make sure that there's no confusion and that your rent is credited properly. Late payments and late fees are an issue that we see pretty regularly. This is called a liquidated damages clause for anybody who's interested. This is essentially the tenant agreeing to pay something if they breach the lease by paying rent late. So in this case, rent's due on the 1st of the month, and the landlord is saying here that if rent's not paid on the due date, then there will be a late fee in the amount of $10 for each day that the balance remains unpaid. And they have their late fees maxed out at $70, which is kind of nice. Actually, some landlords can be a little more excessive in their late fees. And then we go on to look at the security deposit and their statement that they will return the security deposit once they get the forwarding address, minus any deductions, and taking into account any lease renewal terms. They also are making clear here that they're going to send their security deposit return in one check to one tenant. And so they're probably going to ask the tenants to specify who will be the recipient of that deposit return at the end of the lease. That's fairly common. This lease is pretty in-depth on the joint inspection process, which is pretty unique. Well, is unique to this community. And so basically they're following the local ordinance on setting up those inspections. The report and inventory will be completed during the move-in inspection, which is what the ordinance anticipates. One thing about this inspection paragraph that makes it somewhat interesting is that it incorporates the inspection report into the lease itself. That is all the more reason to be thorough and to make sure that that inspection report is accurate. So I go back to what I was saying about the move-in process. Slow down, do a thorough move-in, because you don't want an incomplete move-in inspection to cause you problems at the end of the lease and potentially cost you money for damages you didn't cause. In this lease, the tenant is required to take good care of the premises, fixtures, appliances, and equipment. Tenant agrees to keep the premises at tenant's sole cost and expense in a clean, aesthetically pleasing, and sanitary condition. Personally, I think aesthetically pleasing is a little subjective, but basically this is tracking what the state law says on what tenants need to do to take care of their rental property. And also there's a provision, paragraph 9 here, where the tenant agrees to place all utilities in the tenant's name prior to the lease start date. So this is a good example of, if you're a tenant at this property, the utilities are going to be in your name, and those utility bills will be arriving at the rental unit under your name. And that's just your responsibility as a tenant. Access during the rental term can be an interesting issue for some folks. Basically, landlords are allowed access to the rental property if they provide reasonable notice. Generally, they reserve themselves the right of access to do things like repairs, alterations, to show the property to prospective tenants. They are required under state law to provide reasonable notice to the tenants. And so if you have a situation, I think it's more likely landlord employees sometimes forget about the reasonable notice requirement. And so we do talk to students oftentimes about how to manage those situations, and sometimes reach out to the landlords to remind them of the notice requirement. Maintenance, it's generally going to be the landlord's responsibility to keep and maintain the premises. If there are any issues, again, this makes clear that the tenant needs to report problems to maintenance, including emergency situations. And again, the tenant, for their own protection and to create a record, should put all of those notices in writing. Personal property. I'm just going to say here, before I forget to say the words, that all tenants should have renter's insurance. Landlords are not going to cover your personal property as a tenant, except in cases of gross negligence. It's going to be very much the exception to the rule. If something goes wrong in your rental unit and your property is damaged, that the landlord is going to be responsible. Tenants in this in this lease, the landlord is advising the tenant to obtain renter's insurance. You can go to an agent here in Bloomington. You can speak with your parents or if you have guardians who have homeowners insurance. Sometimes personal property can be covered under an umbrella policy. And so if talk to your parents, buy a policy of insurance of your own if you're not covered through that umbrella policy, because there's really no other coverage you can rely on for your personal property when you're living in a rental unit. So it's just the smart thing to do, and it'll keep you most protected. It's also pretty cheap. Renters policies typically are not very expensive. And so it's generally well worth the investment to have that coverage. So just a couple words about joint and several liability. Each individual signing this lease as a tenant agrees to be jointly and severally liable for the full performance required hereunder and for any damages resulting from breach or default. So this provision does a pretty good job of explaining that each tenant is responsible for everything due under this lease. And that means that if you have 4 people living in a rental unit and 2 of them back out and stop paying rent and can't be found by the landlord can enforce the lease against the remaining 2, or even if there's just 1 of those 4 left. That's how joint and several liability works. And so it catches people off guard and takes them a little bit by surprise because it's not intuitive. And so we wanted to emphasize again how a joint and several liability lease works. So we're gonna next talk about the subletting. Again, if you have plans to be gone or you think you might be gone, you want to make sure that you look at what your lease says about subletting, because generally you're going to need to get the landlord's written consent to sublet your apartment, to sublet your space in an apartment or a house. And it's good to keep in mind that even if you get a subtenant and someone does agree to take over your rent and utility payments for a certain part of your lease, you're still on the hook. This is not a release of your liability under the lease. It's contracting with someone to take over your payment responsibility. But then you need to remember, if your subtenant breaches and stops paying rent in any way, goes back on the agreement they made with you, the landlord can still come after you to collect rent and enforce that lease. So it's not a complete termination of the lease. It's not a release of your liability, but it is a contract that will get someone else on the hook to pay those contract expenses for a term. Winterizing, it's nice when a lease has this provision in here because a lot of folks don't think about it. When students leave for the semester break is typically when this might become an issue. A lot of folks don't want to leave for that period to go home and continue to pay utilities at their rental unit in Bloomington. If you turn off your utilities and the place gets cold, if it gets down below freezing, well below freezing as it often does here that time of the year, then you may have a problem with the plumbing. The pipes can freeze, they can then bust and then cause the rental unit to flood. These situations cause massive damages in rental units, particularly apartment complexes. And we almost always see 1 or 2 of them at least in January when we return from the break. So keep in mind that when you leave, you want to winterize. You want to make sure that if people aren't in your rental unit when it's cold outside, that you keep the heat on. You can leave leave cabinet doors open to expose the pipes to the warmer air and leave a stream of water running. Talk to your landlord about winterizing. Make sure that they know that you know that you need to winterize and take those actions and talk to your roommates. Parking. Parking is complicated. This lease says specifically that the landlord does not guarantee parking for individuals signing the lease. Most apartment complexes will have parking lots, and oftentimes you have to have a tag or sticker to park there. We've had some landlords recently exceed. They've redone their units, and so they have more tenants than they have available parking for. I wouldn't plan on parking necessarily being a given. If you have concerns about that, questions, mobility issues, you want to make sure to talk to your landlord. And if you're having issues with that, you can come and talk to us at SLS and we'll help you work through those situations. But just pay attention to parking. Cars are towed here all the time. Towing companies are pretty aggressive because it's a pretty easy market for them to make money. So just be wary of parking, and it doesn't seem like it's something you should worry about, but it can cause problems. Under paragraph 21 here, default and remedies. In the event of such default or eviction, all remaining rent shall become immediately due and payable without further notice. This is what we call an acceleration clause. And this is the landlord saying, if you breach this lease, we have a right to collect all of the rent due through the end of the lease term. If they go to court and make that claim, sometimes they'll get it, sometimes they won't. The judge sometimes will only award a landlord part of that claim. But it's good to keep in mind that they do have that option. And so if you start having problems with payment and such, do what you can to work it out with the landlord and come to see us. I also will point out at the end of this provision that there's an attorney's fees clause. Most leases in Bloomington include an attorney's fees clause. And what they do is they pass the responsibility for paying an attorney onto the tenant in most situations. And so if you have a dispute under the lease, there's a good chance the landlord is going to try to claim that you owe them attorney's fees in addition to whatever else they're claiming. And that's another thing we help tenants with all the time. Renewal terms, just pay attention to how renewal works in the lease. They work in all different kinds of ways in the leases that we see. Some of them are automatic, some require a notice, like the one here. So just pay attention, especially if you don't want, well, either way, if you decide you want to live in this place, talk to the landlord as soon as you can, make that decision early if you can. And so, you know, that's something, if we see something concerning, and if you come to talk to Student Legal Services about it, we'll point out that you should pay attention to the renewal term in this lease so you know what to expect. We do keep an eye out for those. And then again, in this lease, they're very tuned into the inspection process. So we've got our move out inspection provision. And then under miscellaneous provisions, paragraph 26A, entire agreement. This is one of the reasons that I've been saying, put it in writing, get it in writing, have everybody sign off on it. This is the four corners clause. Basically, what it's saying is anything that's not put in writing and signed off on by the parties must be in writing, fully executed to be enforceable. And so those assurances, the things that leasing agents tell you without putting in writing, that's fine. Maybe they're trying to be helpful. Be sure to get it in writing and make everybody sign off on it. This lease includes rules and regulations. These are a part of the lease. They're incorporated. And if you read through the lease itself, you'll see they're incorporated by reference, saying the rules and regulations are incorporated herein. And so be sure to read and follow the rules and regulations as well as what's in the lease contract itself. We have had lots of students come to us facing threats from landlords of fines or even eviction for failing to comply with rules and regulations. These are the kinds of things, policies and such that are updated, it seems, fairly regularly by a lot of landlords. Sometimes they're very good about providing the rules and regulations along with the lease itself. Sometimes they're not. And so if you see reference to rules and regulations in your lease and you don't have rules and regulations in front of you, you should ask the landlord about that. And again, that's something we talk to students about during our lease analysis. Move out charges or a schedule of charges is a section of the lease we see pretty commonly in Bloomington. They'll just say how much they're going to charge for a drip pan or a light bulb. Certainly cleaning charges will usually be included in here. So be sure to check those out as you're preparing to move out, you're cleaning the place. Replace light bulbs, just replace them out. It's going to be cheaper for you to do it than for the landlord to do it. Check the drip pans on the stove. Those are always replaced, it seems, and costly if they're not perfectly clean and new. So clean those at least and clean thoroughly when you move out. Typically, that's what we recommend anyway. And if you have a list of cleaning charges and cleaning instructions from the landlord, that can be actually somewhat helpful, can give you some guidance on what to do a good move out. And then the signature page, again, if it's a joint and several liability lease, which this is, got lots of signatures on there. It's best, again, because of the joint and several liability. And if you sign it, you may be bound, even if nobody else does. It's good if you can all go in together and sign the lease together. And again, the lease may have you designate a primary contact for return of the security deposit. That part of the program a little early, so we have time for questions. Anybody have?
Jump in here quickly and say, I think I have enabled the panel, the participants, attendees to post chats to the to the panelists. So if you have a question, just throw it in the chat and we will try to address it.
Thanks, Mark.
Kudos to the four of you who have stuck around for this entire thing. This is not the most engaging stuff, although Stacy and everybody makes it as engaging as it can be. So.
And I was going to say, if you have questions, it could be for Andy, it could be for Angela, or for me. It doesn't just have to be.
Sure, that's a great point.
Yeah.
So I see we have one question. Is this information on leasing pretty universal for other places in Indiana and for non-college students? Anybody want to take a stab at this?
I'll start. It's in terms of what the state laws require and the law on contract. So those two areas, like the state statutes and the law of contract in Indiana, that's pretty universal. That's going to be any place in Indiana. The local laws, the inspection program, the property maintenance code, all of that is exclusive to Bloomington. And I think Angela said we're one of 3 or 4 communities in Indiana that has that type of ordinance. Most places you live in Indiana as a tenant, you're not going to get the benefit of that type of inspection program and a city requiring the properties be kept up to a certain level of habitability. But the rest of it is pretty universal. Yeah, it's all state law.
And Stacy, the stuff about kind of best practices for doing inspections and things like that, even though it may not be required by law, would you recommend that, it's just a good way that evidence is useful anywhere?
That's a really good point, Mark, because we kind of tie the doing a thorough move-in inspection and taking pictures to those ordinance requirements here in Bloomington, right? But the point of it really is to create a record for yourself. Because if you're paying a security deposit, or even if you're not, the landlord may try to charge you for damages at the end of the lease that you didn't cause. And so it's a really good idea, just as Mark just said, to note any defects, take those pictures, keep a record, regardless of where you are in Indiana, so that you can bring up those pictures and show the landlord, if they try to charge you for carpet replacement, that the carpet looked like that when you moved in, as an example. That's a very good point, Mark. Thank you.
One of the most gratifying experiences I've had as a step parent was when my stepdaughter moved up to the Indianapolis area, and she was just rigid about having an inspection and took pictures, and she did it all. And it's one less thing to worry about, even though it's not required. If something comes up, she's gonna be glad she has those.
Yeah. It's a very good way to protect yourself and your money.
Yeah. Thanks for the question, Becca. Any other questions? I don't see anything else having popped up. Any closing thoughts from any of our panelists?
Yeah, I'll just say, whenever you seem overwhelmed by something or there's a problem, please try to remember Student Legal Services in the Dean of Students office as a place where you can come ask questions and continue to be reminded of resources that you might have learned here. So we're always happy to help.
I would like to echo that the hand department is here to help you. And if you're not certain that the problem you have, which category it falls under, go to one of either Andy or Stacy's office. If it's a hand issue, they'll refer you to us, and vice versa. If you call us and say, "Oh, I have this problem with my lease," we'll tell you, "Oh, you need to call Student Legal Services." So we work together, and we'll get you to where you need. Just reach out. And I'm sorry for the dogs barking. I apologize.
I always think the animals add to the Zoom experience, so it's nice to hear it.
We can see them. Hey, come on now.
I know.
We feel free to put someone on camera.
Oh,
I love it.
look at
Oh,
that.
wow.
Oh, so sweet.
Adorable.
Oh,
my
thank you
day.
for sharing. Well, I'll just echo what Andy and Angela just said. We're all here to support you. Andy and I are both on campus. Student Legal Services is on campus. And we work with students on issues to help you through stressful times. And sometimes, you know, if you're in a dispute with the landlord or you're just not sure what to do about a lease, it can be very stressful and it can kind of, or very much be a distraction from what you're here to really accomplish. And so Andy's here and the Dean of Students Office and the Division of Student Affairs to connect you with all kinds of resources to help you through legal issues as well as other issues that come from that. Angela's office at the city is essential for tenants living off campus, any tenants living in Bloomington, and we refer students to them all the time. And so, and they're just a font of information. Their website is full of good information for folks living out in the community. So I encourage everyone to look into those resources, look at our websites, and come and see us. To schedule an appointment at Student Legal Services, I've got the getlegal.indiana.edu website up here is the last slide. So feel free to come and see us. And as a part of the Division of Student Affairs, SLS is going to connect you with other resources on campus as well that you may need if you come to see us about a legal issue. So good luck, everyone, and thanks for showing up tonight.
Super. Take note, the first time in recorded history, a lawyer has wrapped up their presentation a half hour early. So that's how you know we're not charging by the hour here.
Age and experience, Mark.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.